Hello, everybody. My name is Trevor Trainor. I am the president of Boarding Building Science and a member of the Thessalon First Nation. I established Boarding Building Science in 2021 as a way to apply my knowledge and experience in building science to Indigenous housing issues. Since that time, I've actually been doing a lot of work in the Arctic and very cold climate areas and areas that are very remote. And I wanted to share some of the learnings that I've gathered along the way with you today. Some of these are technical learnings that I've made, but also a lot of them on the first part of the presentation related to how to do the work and how to gather information about communities that you're not necessarily a part of, you're coming from the outside from. So that brings us to the first lesson from the Arctic that I'm going to present today. That's lesson number one, is get to know your local conditions and the local knowledge within the community. So let's start by understanding the Arctic. And I had to start at this level when I first got going. The Arctic is the northernmost region on Earth. It's generally defined as the area within the Arctic Circle, which is a line of latitude about 66.5 degrees north of the equator. Within this circle are the Arctic Ocean basin and parts of various countries, including Scandinavia, Russia, Canada, Greenland, and Alaska. For the most part, moving forward, I'm going to be talking about the Canadian Arctic. When we talk about the Canadian Arctic, we actually talk about it in a couple of different regions. First of all, in the center, we see Nunavut, which is the territory most associated with being in the Arctic. We also have the northwestern parts of the Northwest Territories in the Yukon, as well as the northern regions of Quebec and Labrador, also included in that area. One of the things we need to understand when working on housing in the Arctic is the current condition of housing. And some Statistics Canada data from 2021 really indicates a significant issue with some of the housing in the Arctic. These values show that approximately 1/3 of the people living in the Inuit Nunangat live in housing that is in need of major repairs. So if we compare that to the Canadian average of about 5%, we can see that there's a significant issue here. We see similar numbers in Indigenous housing in the South, specifically First Nations on reserve, also living in housing in need of major repairs, about 1/3 of First Nations people living on reserve. So these issues are significant, and it's really important to try and drill down and understand the issues behind this. Obviously, there are many issues, including history and governmental funding issues. What I'm going to talk a lot about today are some of the technical issues that are causing these problems. We'll talk a bit more about that later. So, understanding the local conditions, we kind of talked about the Arctic in general, but obviously the various communities and areas of the Arctic can be quite unique and different from each other. So it's always important to understand the local conditions no matter where you're working. And that includes kind of understanding local conditions and being prepared to look beyond those standard sources of knowledge. We'll talk about some of what those standard sources are, but it's also really important to meet and talk with local community experts, builders, building officials, designers, community members, and even homeowners, so that we can understand the issues that they're having with their housing and what their priorities are based on their personal experiences living in the area. So it's always important for you to bring your knowledge and experience into a project when you're working outside of your area, outside of your geography. But it's also important to be aware of personal biases and really try and put those personal biases aside to understand what's happening in the local community. To do that, one of the techniques is we use two-eyed seeing to develop solutions based on both your experience and the experience of the client, or in this case, of the community. Two-eyed seeing refers to learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing and from the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and using both of these eyes together, both of its information together. And this is a concept that was developed and published by Albert Marshall, Micmac Elder. And one of the things that I've realized, it's not always possible to have two perspectives as one person, but to create a team of people who do provide both of these perspectives is really important. And we can do that by working, when we're working with communities outside of our own, by engaging with the community. This involves developing relationships and gaining understanding of the lived experiences of the people in that community. And this requires time. It requires us to dig deeper, ask a lot of questions, and a lot of times to provide interpretation of those answers, to try and understand what the concerns are of the community and how those relate to housing and the technical aspects of that and the design of housing. So that takes time, and that takes a little bit of a different approach and certainly open-mindedness. So let's talk about some of those traditional, I guess, Western ways of knowing. And understanding the climate is one of the things I needed to do when I started to work in the Arctic. So I started with the basic things like the National Building Code of Canada. And right now, the NBC breaks up Canada into 9 climate zones. And if you can see here, Zone 8 in green is a huge climate zone and actually is defined as areas with greater than 7,000 heating degree days. But greater than 7,000 is actually, there's a huge variation within Zone 8 from 7,000 up to probably about 13,000 heating degree days. And so I needed to understand a little bit more about the climate than just it's Zone 8. And I needed to dig a little bit deeper on that. And so we can look at other sources of information. So this is a map showing heating degree days in 1,000 heating degree day jumps. And we can see that within that Zone 8, where the different climate zones are within Zone 8. And I've sort of had to, over the years, develop my version of Zone 8, A, B, C, D, and E, so that when I'm doing design work, I'm not just talking about Zone 8, I'm talking about more specific climate zones within Zone 8. And using this type of information is a good start. Yes, so if we look at, again, back to the normal definition within the building code of our climate zones, you can see Zone 4, Victoria, through Zone 7B, right? So an example that would be Whitehorse in the Yukon. There's a 4,000 heating degree day difference between those two communities, which is pretty extreme, right? We'd all, I think, agree that the climate in Victoria is much different than the climate in Whitehorse. But even within Zone 8, if we look at just the green bars, the difference between Attawapiskat at right around 7,000 heating degree days, and even Cambridge Bay, which is one of the communities I work with, it's almost 12,000 heating degree days. That's a jump of 4,500 heating degree days. And so there's a bigger difference between or within Zone 8 than there is from Zone 4 to Zone 7B. And so that's kind of important to understand and to drill down a little deeper within the context of designing houses for the Arctic, not just considering Zone 8, but all the subzones within that. Another part of understanding the climate is understanding precipitation, and rain is a big one when it comes to building science, when it comes to designing buildings to be durable and to not grow mold, and all of those things that are really important in housing design. And so looking and understanding the exterior moisture, the driving rain, the amount of rain that you're going to see is really important. And so we can start with things like this, with maps that show some of the conditions. It's also really important, again, to talk with the local community about the realities and some of the microclimate issues that might be occurring in their community. Similarly, for wind speed, again, there's some data out there that's going to help us understand wind speed and how that may affect building design. But it's also very localized too. And again, talking with the local community experts on this and people who understand and have lived experience about things like wind speed, things like driving rain and rainstorms, really important. Similarly, for the risk of forest fires, obviously in the Arctic, where there is no trees, the risk of forest fires is really low. But if I was designing a house for southern Manitoba, or southern Alberta, or southern Saskatchewan, this is something I'd really want to take into account. And again, local knowledge is really important in understanding that also. So there's lots of sources of information that we can go to understand things about geography, about the climate. But it's also important to move beyond the data when we're working with a community outside of our own. So to fully understand the housing needs of a community or of a client that has specific needs, we must go beyond the data, and sometimes need to go beyond what is quantifiable. And again, this takes time and this takes a concerted effort. And it involves asking a lot of questions, right? Things like, what are the housing related issues that you've had in the past? You know, what did you like about your previous home, or what did you dislike about that previous home? What building performance features are your top priorities, right? Are you worried mostly about building durability, indoor air quality, comfort, energy efficiency, or maintainability? Sometimes we can't just ask these questions directly. We need to sort of find ways to get to this information by asking questions that are more related to the experience of people living in homes. So talking about, you know, is comfort important in your home is a question you could ask, but maybe it would be better to ask, in your current home, are there areas that are cold? Do you have cold rooms, warmer rooms in the summer, areas that you aren't comfortable in, and sort of understand their experience that way, as opposed to just asking questions like an engineer like myself would ask. It's also important to understand how the lifestyle of the people living in the homes will affect the building design and performance. So a big one in the Arctic is, how many people do we expect to be living in this house? If we're designing a 3-bedroom home, but realistically there could be 8, 10, or 12 people living in that home, how does that change our design? How does that affect how much ventilation we're going to need, what type of building enclosure, what types of windows we're going to need, etc. Also cultural practices, right? What type of activities are happening in the home that maybe we're not used to understanding or seeing? How can those cultural practices, or even just hobbies and interests, affect the building design? Those things are really important. So it's important to sort of listen to the responses and the needs of the client, and also interpret those needs. So how does, you know, if someone tells me that they have a grand piano in their house, they might not necessarily know that that means that they need really good humidity control in their house. But those are the kind of things that we need to be able to bring to light. Similarly, if you have cultural practices like cleaning fish, cleaning game inside the house, how does that affect ventilation? How does that affect the type of surfaces that we want to put in those rooms? All of those things are really important. And so asking a lot of questions and a lot of follow-up questions to get the root of those needs is really important. So that brings me to lesson number 2. Identify the unique challenges for your project, especially when you're working in places that are outside of your understanding, outside of your comfort zone. So when it came to the Arctic, the first one that I needed to understand was overcrowding. So the rapid decay of the existing housing stock, along with the lack of funding for new housing and population growth in Inuit communities, has led to significant overcrowding. It's not unusual at all to see 8 or 10 people living in a 2 or 3 bedroom home. Overcrowding results in more wear and tear on the building, right? Even things like doorknobs and faucets and things like that are getting used a lot more and wear out a lot more quickly. Overcrowding also results in high levels of moisture generation inside of the house and higher levels of interior humidity that need to be dealt with. Generally speaking, overcrowding just results in more moisture problems related to interior moisture. When we talk about overcrowding, we also see similar issues between the Inuit Nunangat and First Nations communities in the south. Overall, 21% of First Nations people live in crowded housing. On reserve, that's even higher at 36%. And so again, about 1/3 of First Nations living on reserve live in overcrowded housing. In the Inuit Nunangat, it's even higher, with in Nunavut specifically, up to 60% of people living in overcrowded housing. And so we need to understand that when it comes to what are the challenges that we're facing, not just the exterior climate, but what about the interior climate? What about wear and tear? What about other things that occur inside the house that we need to design for? So not just that there is overcrowding, but the level of overcrowding really matters. So we can see here in First Nations, not only is there a significant amount of a 1 bedroom shortfall overcrowding, but a significant amount of houses have 2 or 3 or more bedrooms shortfall. So we can imagine that's when we start to talk about, 8 to 10 people in a 3 bedroom home. And in the Inuit Nunangat on the right, we see these issues are even more extreme, with 20% of the population living in houses that have 2 or more bedroom shortfalls. And so overcrowding, as we know, we talked about, can result in high moisture generation, high levels of interior humidity. And then when we combine that with cold weather and extended periods of cold weather, we start to see issues related to air leakage condensation and surface condensation that we don't see in other populations. And the research that I've done over the past 5 or 6 years has shown that it's this air leakage condensation in many cases that's resulting in major issues related to mold, rot, and decay, and these major repairs that these houses require, especially in the Arctic. Much of that is related to interior moisture and how that's managed. So challenge number 2 in the Arctic when it comes to designing for housing is the climate. Colder temperatures result in more heat loss and more heating energy. That's sort of obvious. But also colder temperatures result in more potential condensation hours. So hours of the year that condensation can occur. And we're not just talking about condensation on windows and things that we can see from the inside, but condensation inside of walls and inside of roof systems. So in general, colder temperatures just result in more interior moisture problems related to the moisture in the air inside of our buildings. We'll talk quite a bit more about that and things that we can do about that from a design standpoint. Challenge number 3 are related to the construction itself. There's lots of things, the material transportation, material storage, access to materials, foundation design and construction challenges, as well as the short and challenging construction season, and just in general limited construction capacity. And I'll talk about each of these a bit more. Obviously, transportation of materials into the Arctic is a major issue, and it's a major cost. And so for some remote communities, the cost of housing may be as much as 50% related to transportation costs. When it comes to communities that are serviced by ice roads are becoming less reliable due to climate change and maybe usable for less of the year. The barge delivery season is being extended a little bit due to climate change. However, typically most communities in the Arctic get one barge per year, while one for fuel and then one for everything else. And so there's that huge challenge of getting materials to the communities. Obviously, when it comes to building maintenance and other things that you can't plan as well for, it becomes really challenging. And a lot of materials, especially in emergency situations, need to be flown in. And we can imagine the cost of doing that. Storage of materials, because that barge comes in once a year, usually in September, it usually contains building materials for the next season, and those materials need to be stored somewhere. These are just some random photos I've taken from wandering around different communities in Nunavut. And many of these communities have no storage facilities to keep materials out of the elements. They're counting on tarps, and exposure to the wind and weather can often destroy the tarps, and the materials can get wet and damaged before they're even installed. And so this results in obviously material waste in some cases. In some cases, it results in materials being installed in a wet state, which can be very problematic for the long-term durability of the building, for indoor air quality, and all of those issues that we worry about. Limited resources and capacity is the last one, kind of talk about in this lesson. And that's limited funds for construction costs leads to the lowest cost solutions. So that's one of the issues we see, is we not getting designs that are really for the elements that we're seeing, for the climate, for the interior conditions. There's limited resources for the design of and understanding of the design for durable housing, safe and healthy housing in the Arctic. Limited capacity for construction, right? There's a lot of communities don't have capacity for construction within the community and have to have people flown in to do that. And also limited capacity for inspection and enforcement is a real issue, making sure that the communities are getting what the design was even asking for and getting what they're paying for can be a real challenge and a real expense in these communities. Challenge number 4 is maintenance. Community-owned housing. So most of in a lot of the communities in Nunavut, the community owns the housing. And so there are community housing maintenance crews on site, which is good, but they're also having a lot of challenges keeping up. A lot of the work they do as the community housing authority is sort of emergency work, keeping furnaces turned on, keeping heat on, defrosting doors so people can come and go. There's also a lot of issues related to overcrowding and just the wear and tear of materials, again, of like door handles, faucets, things that wear out in general can wear out very quickly in overcrowded conditions. As we know, the climate and condensation can be a real issue and make maintenance a problem. A lot of we'll see below windows, we'll see a lot of rot just due to the condensation on the windows dripping down. Challenges due to material availability. Again, that barge coming in once a year takes a lot of planning and a little bit of guesswork in terms of what materials we're going to need for maintenance for a given year. And as I mentioned, the maintenance crew often spends their time just doing emergency calls, keeping the heat on, and don't have a lot of time for regular maintenance of mechanical systems, HRVs, etc. So that brings us to the next lesson, lesson number 3. Now we're getting to a little bit more technical learnings, more building science related issues. And that's that lesson number 3 is interior moisture is the primary source of moisture damage in the Arctic. And that's a lot different than what we see in the South, where a lot of times the moisture issues we see are due to exterior moisture. So we talked about overcrowding and how that leads to more interior moisture. So a lot of the activities that are done in the house create moisture. Just people breathing and being biological creatures give off moisture. Then there's things like showers, cooking, drying clothes, things like that. The more people there are, the more moisture is created and generated inside the house and has to be dealt with. And so to understand this part, we need to understand a little bit more about condensation. And typically when we hear the word condensation, we think about that condensation we can see on the windows, but we've also seen a lot of issues related to condensation happening inside of our building enclosure systems, inside of walls, roofs, inside of attics, and how that affects the long-term durability of our materials. So we're going to talk a bit more about understanding interstitial condensation, so the condensation that happens inside of our building enclosure system. I'm just going to turn on the laser pointer for this part. So if we were to look at a standard wall or a standard compact roof system, when I say standard, I mean it has, let's say, a 2x6 stud wall with batt insulation, sheathing, wood sheathing on the exterior, poly and drywall on the interior. One of the important things about this type of design is that all of the temperature difference that occurs from inside the building at 20 to outside the building at -20, all of that temperature drop occurs across this insulation layer. And what that means is that our sheathing is very cold. It's essentially as cold as it is outside at the inside of this sheathing. Similarly, we see that for a compact roof. Vented roofs are a little bit different, but in the Arctic don't work very well. And compact unvented roofs are more of the standard there. And so let's see why the temperature of that sheathing is important. And that's because if we have any air leakage from inside the building into this wall or inside of this roof, if there's any air leakage, that moisture that's in the air is going to condense on this cold surface. And this is what we see regularly in our forensic investigations, that anywhere near an air leak, you'll see a lot of mold, rot, and decay of the sheathing in this area. Even if the dew point of this air, it lands somewhere halfway across this cavity, where the condensation will actually occur is on the next coldest solid surface, which is the sheathing. And so we see the similar thing in a roof, and the collection of this condensation is what's causing a lot of our issues currently. And so the thing that we understand about air leakage condensation and some of the colder the climate, the greater the amount of condensation that's going to form across a winter. And that's because just there's more hours of the year where that condensation can occur. We also know that the greater the amount of air leakage, the greater the condensation. There's more moisture that's being fed due to greater air leakage, and more of that moisture is available to condense. We also know that the higher the interior relative humidity, the greater the amount of condensation that occurs inside the wall. And knowing these three things, that gives us some design options and ways to try and manipulate that to reduce the risk of condensation. We'll talk a bit more about that. And so just quickly, we hear often about vapor barriers in our industry, and stopping vapor diffusion with a vapor barrier is actually quite easy. What's a lot more difficult is stopping airflow and having that vapor barrier also act as an air barrier. The important thing to remember is that air leakage can move up to 100 times more moisture into a wall system than vapor diffusion. And so the air barrier system is really what's important and what's protecting our walls most of all from moisture damage. I'm now going to go through a series of models that I've developed. The purpose of this is to look at the different effects of different elements on the amount of condensation that occurs inside of our walls. And so what I'm going to show you are a series of graphs And what the graphs represent are the moisture content of the sheathing on the outside of a wall under given conditions. And the important thing to remember as we see these graphs, if the moisture content stays below 20% moisture content, we have a low risk of mold, rot, and decay. If it gets up above 20, below 28%, it's a medium risk. And once we're above 28%, we're at a high risk for mold growth, rot, and decay of the building enclosure system. And so first thing we're going to look at is our standard wall, right? Just a wall with bad insulation in a Toronto climate. And so remember, the temperature drop occurs across the wall. The sheathing's cold. There's a given amount in this model of air leakage, and we've chosen an amount we think is for the model that is realistic. It's not high or low. It's kind of a moderate amount. And if we were to look at this model and put these conditions into a Toronto climate, this is what happens to the moisture content over 3 different winters. We see that it peaks every winter at about 20%, dries back down every summer. And what this tells us from the model is that this is a pretty safe condition, so that this wall is probably not going to have mold growth, rot, or decay in the Toronto climate. But as soon as we change the climate and we move this to a colder climate, let's look at Winnipeg. That's the blue line here. So if we were to put this same conditions here, but in a Winnipeg climate, we see that every winter the moisture content climbs up quite a bit more than in Toronto. Because of the colder climate, we see the moisture content reach almost about 28%, getting to the top end of this medium risk zone every winter. It does dry back down every summer, but we are spending more and more time, more hours of the year in this medium risk zone, which starts to give us concerns about mold growth, rot, and decay. And if we were to look at this in a much colder climate, in a Iqaluit climate, we can see that the moisture content of the sheathing climbs every winter and gets higher and higher across the first 3 winters, to the point where it's not even able to dry down really into the safe low risk zone every winter. So this is a major concern now for mold growth, rot, and decay. And it really just demonstrates how we can't just take designs that work fine in the south and move them to the north. We need to consider the effect of climate on these designs. So that leads us to question number 4. And the question being, what can we do about designing for cold climates? And that brings us to number 4. Exterior insulation is an effective defense against air leakage condensation. So what do we mean by that, and how does that work? So remember our standard wall, where all of the temperature drop occurs across this batt insulation inside this wall, and we have really cold sheathing, pretty much the temperature of outside. If we were to add insulation to the exterior side of this framed wall, what it does is it changes how temperature drops across the wall. And now our sheathing is much warmer than it was before. So depending on how much insulation we use here is going to affect our sheathing temperature. And we'll talk a bit about how that works and how that affects the amount of condensation that occurs inside of our wall systems due to air leakage. Another important thing to remember, though, is that when it comes to monitoring the moisture content of our sheathing, there's 2 factors involved. There's the amount of condensation that's feeding moisture into the wall, and then there's the ability of that moisture to dry out. And so one of the things to consider is when we add foam board exterior insulation to a wall, we are raising the temperature of the sheathing, which is going to reduce condensation, but we're also reducing the ability of any moisture that's in this sheathing to dry outward. And so we're kind of playing with this balance a little bit. We've reduced wetting, but we've also reduced drying. And so that can get a little complicated, but the modeling really helps us understand that a lot better. So let's look at our modeling. We're going to look at our standard wall again in Iqaluit. So no exterior insulation. We know that in Iqaluit, if we use this wall with this amount of air leakage, we have a really high risk for mold growth and moisture issues inside of our walls. What happens when we start adding exterior insulation? Well, in this case, if we add 2 inches of XPS exterior foam board, we can see what happens. It's the blue line. And what happens over time is it actually is worse than having no exterior insulation from a moisture perspective. And the reason that is because we've added we've raised the temperature of our sheathing, but we haven't raised it enough to significantly reduce the amount of condensation. And we've kind of completely shut off drying to the exterior. And so it helps in the short term a little bit, but in the long term, moisture is now building up inside of this wall, even more so than before because of that lack of drying. So what can we do about that? Well, we can add more exterior insulation. If we add 4 inches of XPS in this case, that's the black line. We can see now we've dramatically reduced the moisture content that peaks out every year. In this case, we're getting up still in the sort of high part of the medium risk zone, but a significant improvement over having no exterior insulation. And if we add even more, that's this pink line. That's 6 inches of exterior insulation in this case. We've significantly reduced the moisture content of the sheathing, and now it's completely within the low risk zone for mold growth, rot, and decay. So the important lesson here is that depending on the climate, if we're adding foam board, we just have to make sure we're adding enough to significantly reduce that condensation because we are cutting off some of the drying capacity. What other options do we have though? So there's another option in terms of exterior insulation, and that's a vapor permeable version of exterior insulation. Something like semi-rigid mineral wool would be a good example of that. And how that can be really useful, especially in very cold climates, is that because it's exterior insulation, it raises the temperature of our sheathing and reduces the amount of condensation. But because it's completely vapor permeable, it allows drying to the exterior. And so now, if you look at our moisture balance here, we've reduced wetting and we've not impeded our drying. So that's going to have a different effect on the overall moisture performance of this wall system. And let's look at the modeling and see how that would work. So again, if we look at our wall in a Caluit with no exterior insulation and what that looks like in terms of moisture content, once we start adding a vapor permeable insulation to the exterior, even if we add just 2 inches in this case, that's the blue line, we are now completely within at least the medium risk zone. So remember when we added 2 inches of foam board, we made it worse. We added 2 inches of mineral wool, we've made it significantly better. If we add even just 1 more inch of mineral wool in this case, that's the black line. Now our sheathing moisture content is completely within the low risk zone. And so because we've added exterior insulation that doesn't prevent drying to the exterior, now we can use less of it and still get the benefits from a moisture perspective. And so we've seen these results in southern climates, and they can be really, really small changes. But when we look at it in very cold climates, again, Arctic climates, the difference between vapor permeable exterior insulation and vapor closed exterior insulations is really significant. So that leads us now on to lesson number 5, and that is that building air tightness is an effective defense against air leakage condensation. And so how do we do that? How do we improve the air tightness of our buildings? We do that by designing and installing a very good air barrier system. So the air barrier could be on the interior, like your interior poly, which is very typical, or it could be on the exterior of the building. The important thing is that it's got to be continuous and effective at stopping airflow. What we have found is that oftentimes it's easier to keep the air barrier continuous by putting it on the exterior of the structure. There's less transitions required to do that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that 6 mil poly sheet on the inside. We have other options, including using the exterior house wrap, as the air barrier, taping all the joints and taping transitions. Exterior rigid insulation could be used as an air barrier if all the joints are taped and sealed and transitions are made. Same with exterior sheathing could be used. We could even potentially use 2-pound spray foam. And there's some caveats that come along with that, including things like doing air sealing on areas that aren't covered by the spray foam, like doubled up studs and other areas. The important part, though, is that we must be completely sealed for air tightness at transitions from walls to roof and walls to foundations, and at penetrations like windows and other mechanical penetrations. It's relatively easy to make the center of a wall airtight, but where it becomes challenging is at these transitions and these penetrations. And it's also important to note that the only way to know if we've achieved good air tightness is by measuring air tightness. And we do that through blower door testing. And so if we don't measure it, it's really hard to understand what we're dealing with. And so let's go back to our model for a minute and look at how air tightness affects air leakage condensation. And the example we're going to use in this case is our Iqaluit climate. And we're going to look at a wall with 4 inches of XPS foam board insulation. And so if we look at the results of that at 2.5 air changes per hour as a test result, so sort of what we would call like typical new construction air tightness, we can see that the moisture content of the sheathing due to that amount of air leakage results in a lot of time spent in this medium risk zone, starting to get even to the higher risk zone. And so what happens when we change that? If that was worse, if now we change that to 5 air changes per hour, we can see a significant increase in moisture content of the sheathing, putting us sort of well into the high risk zone for mold growth, rot, and decay. Well, what happens if we make that better? If we get that down to 1.5 air changes per hour, that's this black line, we're staying almost completely within the low risk zone. And so that makes a real significant difference, even going from standard air tightness at about 2.5 to decent air tightness at 1.5 can make a big difference in terms of moisture. And if we were to drop that down to like a passive house level of air tightness, we can see that it's improved again and completely within the low risk zone. And so we talked about measuring air tightness. How do we do that? With blower door testing. And so the keys to improving whole building air tightness are first to set a standard for whole building air tightness. I'm recommending at this point trying to get to a standard of 1.5 air changes per hour. I think that can make a significant difference, especially in the Arctic housing that I'm working with. And it's still pretty realistic to get to that goal with good detailing. We can do that. We can help the builders by having the designers create effective and buildable air barrier details. We can help by having inspectors perform quality control reviews of the air barrier installation. And eventually, we need to test them using blower door testing. And until we really understand how to achieve, these levels that we're shooting for, we need to test all the buildings, is my argument. Maybe once we understand what techniques result in what sort of results, then maybe we just do a sampling. But for now, I'm really recommending that we perform blower door testing on all new units. And it's really important to support the contractors in meeting these goals, but also to hold them responsible. So that's sort of a fine line, but we're all a team working together to meet these goals. And so supporting them is really important from a designer standpoint, like myself, designing buildable air barrier systems and then supporting the contractors to install those. That leads us to lesson number 6, and that's reducing interior relative humidity can reduce air leakage condensation. And so how does ventilation reduce interior relative humidity? Well, to understand that, we need to look at this fancy table here. the psychrometric chart. We'll try and look at it in a bit of a simpler way. It's not as complicated as it looks, let's say. Let's say we have outdoor air. This blue dot represents the condition of outdoor air at minus 15 Celsius and essentially 100% relative humidity. Okay, so when it's really cold outside, the air can't hold much moisture, so you're going to have very high relative humidity levels in that air. But as soon as we bring that air inside using ventilation and we warm that up to say 20, now we've got air at 20 degrees, and instead of being at 100% relative humidity, it's now at 10% relative humidity. So the more cold, dry air we bring from inside and warm up, and the more warm, moist air we take out of our buildings and send outside, the lower the relative humidity in our buildings is going to be. And how do we do that? The most effective way is with a whole building ventilation system, such as an HRV. And so during cold weather, like we said, replacing the warm, moist air inside our buildings with cold, dry air will reduce the humidity levels inside of our homes. Ventilation also has the positive effect on indoor air quality. So removing indoor air pollutants and replacing them with higher quality outdoor air. And then what an HRV can do is use the heat of the outgoing air to warm up the incoming air to help save energy and improve comfort. So we're not just bringing cold outdoor air and pushing it into our homes, we're pre-warming it. But one of the issues we see in the Arctic and in very cold climates is that frost formation inside of this core is a real problem. And the HRV ends up running in defrost mode for a significant amount of time. And when it's in defrost mode, it's not performing its ventilation role. It's just defrosting itself. And so one of the things, ways to overcome that's been being used currently in the Arctic is to preheat that cold air that's being brought in. It does work in terms of improving the amount of ventilation. It also, reduces the heat exchange, and has some energy penalties to it. But that's basically the way to keep it working in an extreme cold environment. This is just some results from a study showing the defrost cycles at, I believe this is at minus 20, at minus 20 degree outdoor air for a traditional cross-flow HRV. And what we can see is that every time that it goes into defrost mode here, that we are not ventilating during those times. And so there's a significant reduction in the amount of ventilation. And so that's why preheat is really important in some climates. There are other types of HRVs coming to market that may help, but as of right now, they're something like a dual core reverse flow HRVs, but they're very expensive and they're not very realistic for housing in the Arctic at this time. Yeah, we talked about preheating the coils and how that affects our energy use, but that's what it is required at this time to use HRVs in the Arctic. So let's look at how that interior relative humidity affects the amount of condensation using our model again. We're going to look at our model in Iqaluit again with 4 inches of XPS with our 2.5 air changes per hour air leakage rate. So if we're able to maintain under these conditions 35% wintertime relative humidity, what we can see is that for the most part, we remain within the low risk zone in terms of moisture content of the sheathing. We're getting just up into the medium risk zone. But if we can maintain that 35%, we're relatively safe. However, if that ends up reaching 40% relative humidity in the winter, the indoor air, it makes a significant problem for us in that now the moisture content is reaching well into the medium risk zone, starting to get into the high risk zone. And so that 5% difference makes a significant difference in terms of condensation risk. And if we allow that interior relative humidity to get to 45% in the winter, if we don't have proper ventilation, if we have overcrowding and lots of moisture generation, this is the issue we get into, in that the moisture content climbs well into the high risk zone just because of that difference in interior relative humidity. And so currently we're trying to recommend that we stay below 35% wintertime relative humidity. 30 to 35% seems to be realistic with the technology we currently have. Even in some overcrowded conditions, that gets challenging, but 35% and below really makes a big difference in terms of moisture condensation risk. Okay, so quick summary of our lessons from the Arctic. Lesson number 1 is to get to know the local conditions and the local knowledge within the community. And so, that can apply to working somewhere outside of your experience, or it could just involve working with a client that you don't know yet, and you need to get to know what their understanding of things are, what their knowledge is. Lesson number 2, identify the unique challenges for the project. Every project is going to be different. In the Arctic, we have really unique challenges in terms of climate, in terms of transportation, construction, capacity. And so it's really important to understand those when we're designing housing and trying to provide housing to different clients. Lesson number 3, interior moisture is the primary source of moisture damage in the Arctic. It can also be a very significant source of moisture problems in the rest of Canada, in the south, and in normal cold climates. Lesson number 4, exterior insulation is an effective defense against air leakage condensation. And so we saw some examples of that and how much exterior insulation we need in very cold climates to reduce condensation. In your climate, it may be much less exterior insulation required, but all of the physics and the applies, and it's still, exterior insulation can be a very good approach in all cold climates. Building air tightness is an effective defense against air leakage condensation. We often think of air tightness as an energy issue, and it is, but it also can have significant effects on moisture and moisture accumulation within the walls and the roof systems of our homes. And then finally, lesson number 6, reducing interior relative humidity reduces air leakage condensation risk. And the best way to do that is with proper ventilation strategies, keeping in mind that in the Arctic, HRVs have issues and tend to frost up and may need some extra design to avoid that. Thanks everyone for attending my presentation. I hope you learned something today. And also, if you have any questions, have any comments, please feel free to contact me using the information below. I'm always open to learning more about all of these topics from people who work in the industry. So I look forward to that. Thank you.